This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Catherine Davis. I'm the Director of Digital Language Research here. It's my pleasure to invite you all this evening and to welcome you, and also to welcome our speaker, A.S. Byatt, and her husband, and to say a few words about the Bithell Trust, because this event is funded by the Bithell Trust. And one of my jobs is to go into the history of all of these things, and I do find it absolutely fascinating. So the Bithell Bequest Fund was set up in memory of Jethro Bithell. And Jethro Bithell was born in 1878 and was educated at the Wigan Mining School and Manchester University, where he took a first in modern languages in 1900. He was lecturer in German at Manchester University from 1904 to 1910, and then he came until his retirement to Birkbeck, and he was reader and head of German at Birkbeck College, as you know, over the road. So he died in 1962, left his estate in trust to his wife, Dr. Alice Emily Bithell, and then when she died in 1974, they left all the estate to the Institute of Germanic Studies. And so it has been since then. It's a wonderful bequest, because not only does it fund the Bithell Memorial Lecture series, to begin with annually and now biannually, since 1975, so yeah, it's 40 years, isn't it? But this trust also funds the publication of dissertations, PhD dissertations in the form of books, which helps young scholars immensely, and buys lots of books for Senate House Library on Germanic studies subjects. So thank you to the Bithell Trust, and thank you to A.S. Byatt for coming this evening, and thank you to Godela Weiss-Sussex, who heads up Germanic Studies in the Institute, who's going to introduce our speaker, and thank you Jane Lewin, who has been here many years and without whom we would not be able to do anything. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And yes, my name is Godela Weiss-Sussex. I convene German Studies at the Institute. And I would just like to join my welcome to Catherine's welcome. Because we're having a little bit of a departure from normal Bithell lectures, so we're going to have a conversation rather than a lecture, that allows me to introduce two guests, which is, really much better than usual. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dame Antonia Byatt and Martin Swales. Antonia Byatt, or A.S. Byatt, of course, is one of the greatest writers of fiction in the English language today. I'll just remind you of her novel Possession, 1990, which won the Booker Prize that year. But of course, that novel was preceded and also followed by lots of other novels, short stories, and lots of critical writing as well. Lots of thoughts on how to write, on the best forms of writing, and also critical texts on German literature. Dame Antonia has written introductions to some of the greatest German texts, one to Faust I, I think it was, in 2005, and in the same year, an introduction to Der Zauberberg. So it's really a very, very European endeavor, and I think I can say you are a very European writer. And it's especially this concern with German culture and with German fairy tales, German philosophy, art, visual arts, the literature, Marionettentheater, puppet play. All these strands of German culture come up again and again in the work of A.S. Byatt. And it was in particular when we were reading the children's book. I don't know how many of you have read that. The children's book, which came out in 2009. And when we were reading it, Martin and I talked about it, and we both felt we need to know more. We want to know more about the place of German culture in your work and the significance of German culture for you. So we are therefore embarking on this conversation, and the conversation we are hoping to develop strands, and it's really, I think, very much in keeping with the children's book, which is also lots of layers, lots of strands. So a conversation is never linear, and we know we'll probably double back on ourselves and develop in conversation the different strands that we want to talk about. And of course, Martin Swales is the best partner in this conversation that I could possibly have. He is not only Emeritus Professor of German, but he's also one of the most inspiring and thoughtful scholars in German in this country. And more than that, Antonia and Martin were colleagues for a number of years at UCL when Antonia was teaching in English and Martin was in German. So in a way, I hope this is going to be a continuation of a conversation that started a long time ago. We'll start with the children's book, but I hope that in the course of the conversation we'll also come to talk about the wonderful Ragnarök and also about the book that Antonia is writing at the moment. So, starting with the children's book, just to give you a very, very quick survey, it's a book about the children or the generation of children born in the 1880s. So it's about that very interesting fin de siècle time when there were lots of reforms, lots of reform thinking in the air. Think of the Fabians and new socialism. But it is also a time. No, I'm not going to say more about the time. No. Let's just go into the novel. So the novel focuses on one particular family, the Elwood family, who's based in Kent, and in particular on the mother of 7, and also a writer. She's a writer of children's stories. And we've asked AS5 to start by reading a very short extract from the book. And in this extract, we eavesdrop, as it were, on a conversation between this mother, this writer, Olive Elwood, and she's talking to a theatre director, August Steiner.
This is the right page, but
Yeah.
I'm sure I begin. I think that's here.
Yes. If you could start there.
Okay, yeah. The maid brought a tea tray and set up a table. She poured tea. August Steining said it always did him good to be in that garden. It was a hive of energy. He could feel Olive's mind hovering and inventing in that garden, finding strange creatures in the shrubbery and drama in the bonfire. Did she remember their discussion of that fairy play? He wanted to suggest to her that she might write him a tale, a play, a real work of the imagination, strange and wonderful, not pretty, like the Austrians, like Hofmannsthal, or like the Ring of the Nibelungen. He was so sick of tea parties on the stage, and of cheeky servants, and soubrette, and jeune ingénue. He wanted to make people's hair stand on end. Adventure, danger, dark and light. Olive drew him out and gave him sandwiches and iced biscuits. He talked about the mood in the world of the arts. Everyone, he said, was reading stories originally written for children, stories of magic, stories of quests, stories of half-humans who are still in touch with the ancient earth, of speaking beasts and centaurs, Pan and Puck. He was quite sure she could write him a play along those lines, in that dream world, that was more real than urban rattle. He wanted to do something delightful and complicated with mirrors and lights and wires and shadows. Olive said, her voice dragging a little, that she was writing a tale about a boy, a prince, who lost his shadow and went underground in search of it. How did he lose it? Well, it was snipped off his feet in his cradle by a monstrous rat with sharp yellow teeth, who rolled it up and took it behind the skirting board and down horrible holes underground to the Queen of the Shadows. His family, the King and Queen, tried to keep him safe in the walled garden. You know how these things always. But he meets the Queen of Elfland, who needs his help, and carries him away on her white horse with bells, through seas of blood abune the knee, of course, to the opening of a mine shaft. And he has to go in, and further in, and further in, and meets all sorts of strange creatures down there, some friendly, some evil, some indifferent. Does he get it back? I haven't got there yet. It's an interminable story. I'm telling it for Tom. Each of my children, she said, in the charming voice with which she had spoken to the journalist, has his or her own story in his or her own notebook. They were bedtime stories, but now the children are older, and some of them are. They're a kind of game. I don't know why I keep that going. Sometimes it feels a little silly. You know what you have said about stories under the hills, of old things and inhuman things, and magic that used to run through everything and has now shrunk to odd little patches of magic woods and hummocks. Toby Yulgrave talks a great deal about the brothers Grimm and their belief that fairy tales were the old religion, the old inner life of the German people. Well, I sometimes feel that stories are the inner life of this house, a kind of spinning of energy. I am this spinning fairy in the attic. I am Mother Goose, quacking away what sounds like comforting chatter, but is really what holds it all together. She gave a little laugh and said, well, it makes money, it does hold it all together.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you would like to start by telling us a little bit more about this. It holds it all together. I think that's wonderfully evocative of what's actually going on.
Olive isn't quite what she looks to be. She looks to be one of those writing ladies at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, who invents a fairy world. But she's in fact the daughter of a miner who died horribly in a mine, and his brother, and her brother, who died horribly in a mine. And she's got away from north of England poverty. And she kept herself going as a child by telling herself stories. And when she gets to London, she starts telling stories. And then she starts publishing stories. And she gets more and more involved in them. And of course, stories are extremely dangerous. If you tell stories about people, even yourself, perhaps mostly yourself, you can do immense damage. So the novel works on two levels. It works that we can't live without constantly telling stories. And it works to say, if you continue to tell stories, I've forgotten now, there's a character, there's a character in a novel who says, telling stories is telling lies. And it works at that level, so the fantasy world is sometimes very destructive and sometimes very helpful. And it moves between Germany and England.
There's also a sense, isn't there, that in which there has to be agreement about the stories that are told. And as long as there's agreement, there is an enchanted world that can exist. But the moment that somebody opts out, it
will go. Or the moment that somebody uses it too much, it can go. I think I ought to say how the novel began, because I've been trying to think how it got to be about Germany and Britain, which it very much is. And it actually began with me noticing that the children of children's story writers tend to commit suicide. There is an incredible preponderance of children of British children's story writers who felt it necessary to be dead. And I spent a lot of time worrying about that, and I didn't solve it really. I thought perhaps they wished to be dead because they thought there was no room in their mother's life for them, or father's life, because they just went on and on telling stories. And I was thinking about Kenneth Graham, who wrote The Wind in the Willows for his son. And his son got as far as Oxford and went and threw himself under a train. And this is only one of my examples. But he also tried to throw himself under cars in London as a little boy. And everybody talked about, to me in my childhood, about how wonderful it was to have been told The Wind in the Willows when you were a little boy, that was written specially for you. It obviously wasn't. A poor boy. And in fact, they were so frightened of him throwing himself under cars, this is now beginning to be a digression, that they sent him away to the country. So his father didn't read the story to him, he sent it in envelopes. But it's that kind of feeling I partly wanted to get.
And you have a female character, Dorothy, who resists.
Yes, I'm very fond of Dorothy. When I wrote this novel, I was particularly influenced by something Iris Murdoch said about how there should be as many characters as possible in a novel. There shouldn't be just one central one. She said every time she finished a novel, she found she wanted to write it again from the point of view of the characters who she hadn't written about. And this was a moral statement by her. You should imagine large numbers of people, not just one, which is why I've never written in the first person. I was rereading this morning to come here, and the number of people I put in this is sort of terrifying.
Sorry, Martin.
No.
To me, Dorothy isn't just one of many. She is, I think she's very important because she shows how difficult it is to resist being written into a story, but that it is possible.
Yes, she's very tough. She decides as a very small girl to be a doctor. And I tend to write novels about worlds of art and worlds of literature. And I can't do it without there being at least one character in the novel, and preferably more than one, who don't give a damn about literature and art, because the world is full of people who don't give a damn. And Dorothy decides to resist. She decides to resist Olive's storytelling, and she goes to medical school. And I was appalled when I found out what the syllabus was for what her medical studies would have been in those days. And it took her so much too long to get herself educated that there was no possibility of her having friends or marrying or anything. And that was one person. But she has a brother, Tom, who can't get out of the stories at all.
Yeah. And that is his nemesis, ultimately, isn't it? Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
he
yes.
doesn't know what else there is.
Yeah. Just to add my little threepenny worth, or whatever it is, about this novel, it is a hugely rich novel. We've heard one aspect, or one group of aspects from it. Clearly it's a family novel, and I think it's a family novel that, like any good family novel, it makes us care about the people. It does matter to us. It's also hugely interesting about things, objects, about material entities. It's also a historical novel, 1895 to the First World War, and it's also a novel of ideas. And the extraordinary thing is, it belongs together. It's not a patchwork. You can hear the various strands listening to each other, debating, bouncing, as it were, significances of each other. Can I ask you, Antonia, firstly about about the physical objects, because you love them dearly, and you ask us to love them dearly, and we do, under your tutelage. Why is that particularly important for you?
I've been reading Hugo von Hofmannsthal about the impossibility of language. I think I mistrust language, and I mistrust abstract words, even though if you're going to work like me, you have to know how to put them in. But they're always provisional and suspicious. Whereas a thing is a thing. It isn't, of course, because two people will see a painting completely differently. And my sort of artist hero is a potter who is a working class boy who creeps into the British Museum and hides in the basement and is rescued by helpful, Quakerly people who educate the deserving, and he gets educated. But he's Dorothy's opposite. He is as obsessed with making things, and I can't write and I can't think without a lot of very concrete objects. And in a sense, the objects which exist in the novel are also a metaphor for the novel. It is itself an object. And I spend an enormous amount of time inventing teacups that nobody ever made, clothes that nobody ever wore, and meals that nobody ever ate. And I had a sort of wonderful time sort of coming on to the Germans a bit. I didn't know about Germany in this period. I had to work it up, and I kept discovering amazing and wonderful things that were German and not English. And then you weave them in. But yes, there's a. I could read a bit about the vase. There's a vase on Olive's stairs. This is a much smaller bit. But Philip the potter goes into her house and sees this vase or jar. Philip is the working class boy, and he is being brought into the family and told to go and help make decorations for the garden party that's going to happen. He was to go up to the schoolroom where the lanterns were being made up. The imposing staircase took an interesting turn as it went up. In an alcove at the turning, standing on an oak coffin stool, was a jar. It was a large earthenware vessel that bellied out and curved in again to a tall neck with a fine lip. The glaze was silver gold, with veilings of aquamarine. The light flowed round the surface, like clouds reflected in water. It was a watery pot. There was a vertical rhythm of rising stems, water weeds, and a dashing horizontal rhythm of irregular clouds of black-brown wriggling commas, which turned out, inspected closely, to be lifelike tadpoles with translucent tails. The jar had several asymmetric handles, which seemed to grow out of it like roots in water, but turned out to have the sly faces and flickering tails of water snakes, green-spotted gold. It rested on 4 dark green feet, which were coiled, scaled lizards, or minor dragons, lying with closed eyes and resting snouts. Well, I had fun making that up. Part of what I think you were saying, I couldn't have gone on without really seeing that jar.
No.
I couldn't just say Philip saw a jar and knew that he was...
Yeah.
Everything I do is rather like that. And so I write very slowly.
Yeah.
I think what's important here is that this is Philip's view of the vase, isn't it? It's very much his, very tactile and very, seeing the colours, seeing the paint, and it's very much his view.
He also sees the order and the form,
Yeah.
because Olive comes up the stairs in the next paragraph. Olive Elwood came up behind him and put an arm about his shoulder. She smelled of roses. Philip resisted shrugging. He disliked being touched, especially at private times. It's an amazing pot, don't you think? We chose it for the pretty tadpoles. They go with our idea of toad frag. The little ones love to stroke them. She's obviously not seen it
No.
at all. And yet she owns it and she loves it.
She loves it, yes.
And
I think one of the interesting things, listening to you read that, and time and again there are objects that are brought alive, is that obviously in any novel of substance and stature, your novel has both those properties. The matter, the materiality, matters because it signifies, it speaks of itself and beyond itself. And that's where, if I can nudge you in that direction, because that takes us into things German, you love the novel of ideas. So you love the novel of things, you love the novel of people, but you love the novel of ideas because ideas are the generators of matter becoming mattering, as it were. Can you say something about how as a novelist, you say how vividly and necessary to you the things are, but so are ideas, that the characters have ideas, have thoughts, that you as narrative presence enter the novel and think aloud. And that's a wonderful property, and in some ways it's a rather Germanic property. The Germans do it rather well, you do it wonderfully. How does it go alongside that wonderful physicality? The Germans are not always that good at physicality, you're terrific at it.
thank you. It's partly because the English are almost all agnostic.
Yeah.
They don't have a thinking system to which they adhere, I think. Perhaps all of you do. But, I think one of the great moments of my life, when you said that about the novel of ideas, I immediately thought of two texts, or three texts, the first of which was Middlemarch. When I first met George Eliot, which was after I left university, there was, and of course she was a Germanist, she read German, and I think that changed the way she wrote very, very deeply. But there were things which were enacting parts in her story, and there were people, and there were thoughts. And I needed that. But much earlier than that, when I was doing German A-level, we did Tonio Kröger. And I thought, here is something which has a completely perfect shape, and a completely perfect set of characters, and a completely perfect idea. And I don't know anything in English that is written like that. And that is how I came to write the introduction to The Magic Mountain, because I saw I needed him, I needed Thomas Mann. Which has meant a lot to me. I did actually manage to read The Magic Mountain in German, despite only having A-level, and it being a very difficult book. But that was, you actually need the real words. So the things run into ideas and run out again. And the rhythm of things in Tonio Kröger, which he keeps repeating, I learned a lot from.
It seems to me also that it's not only the ideas and the things, but there is a third part. It's the language itself. I'm thinking of there's a particular place in the novel where people talk about the gibbous waxing moon, and they say this in front of Philip, who has not much education, and he doesn't understand the word, but he forms an idea of it, and then he immediately, in his imagination, forms it into an object.
Yes.
And it's those three steps that seem to belong together very much.
Yes, and they are, of course, what writing is to me. It's, you need all three things. You need the language. I remember once I was giving a lecture, and I remember as you get very old, you have certain memories which you realise have directed your life. And one of my memories is giving a lecture in Hull, and a very angry student stood up at the end of it, and she said, "In your novel, you have used words I didn't know. What do you have to say about that? So I said, well, I would have rushed and got a dictionary if I were you, and I would have been so excited. And that is, that is how I was when I first met the Gibbous Moon. A dictionary is a wonderful thing. Of course, the nice thing about German is I constantly need a German dictionary, so I lie in bed with Thomas Mann on one side and a huge German dictionary on the other side. And the pleasure of language is entirely sensuous because you hear the words, and entirely abstract because you arrange them.
That seems to lead very directly to Ragnarök, because there I felt it's a story, or it's a version of telling the story of the Nordic gods, and in that I felt very much that sometimes it's just a delight of the names.
Well, they have wonderful meanings. This is a very important book to me, Asgard and the Gods, which was written by somebody called W. Wegener, who was German. And my mother studied English at Cambridge, and unlike me, she had to do ancient Norse, and so she needed to mug up on it. So she bought this book, Asgard and the Gods, which was a book about about Northern mythology. It wasn't for children, it was a proper book written by a German. And in the war, I read this about once every 10 days because I hadn't got anything that was grown up enough and at the same time exciting enough to read. I used to read Hans Andersen, but he depressed me. And I used to read the Brothers Grimm, to whom we will come. But Asgard and the Gods was very scholarly in German. It had a sort of wonderful introduction which said, this tells us so much about our German culture. And I was a sort of 8-year-old child at war with Germany, being bombed, with a very crude idea of what a German was and a very strong idea of what Hitler was, even if simplified. And to meet this wonderful German who had written this introduction to this totally wonderful book, which I liked much more than the French fairy stories. It was it was a kind of thing I kept with myself. Thought to myself, yes, there are Germans. There are Germans who are people as well as this problem that we have and all this terrible state of affairs that we have. I still reread it from time to time. And I wrote in Ragnarok about a thin child who was myself, but it was very important, it shouldn't be autobiographical. And this child read this book and thought about it while going to school. I have lost where I was going.
So it has some autobiographical seed in it.
There's nothing in it that could be autobiographical. It's not, to my knowledge, completely true, but it's not an autobiography. It's the story of my relation with Asgard and the gods. And the thing I thought about it, I've got it back again now, was that I knew these were myths, but they were very much more true than the Christianity I was getting in school and church. We had these pretty pictures in church of Jesus blessing the children. And I felt this, I'm sure I'm sort of ameliorating this, but I felt that the children in the church were nothing much to do with anything that was happening in my life. They were somebody's imagination, as was the infant Jesus. Whereas the Norse gods were terrible, and what happened was terrible. And most of all, what I loved about the Norse gods was that they came to an end. They were destroyed. They rode out to the last battle, and they knew it was the last battle. And I thought, this is really tough, because we do ride out to the last battle, and mostly in a fairy story or a myth, something goes right that stops you being at the last battle. But all these people rode out, and were dead. So that was another deep idea I had of Germans from very early on. They had a mythology that stood up to the world we actually live in, even though it wasn't true. So that mattered a lot to me. And
going back to the passage you read at the beginning, you refer there to the Grimms, and I think you like the darkness in the Grimm notion, don't you?
yes, I love the Grimms, terrible though they are, and they are terrible, but I can't bear, I mean, I rationally can't bear people who say they oughtn't to be read to children or shouldn't be studied because they're so terrible. I feel exactly the opposite. I feel, again, like I did about Ragnarok, that the Grimms are telling a kind of truth. It's only one kind, and you can reject it. But I was writing something about the Grimms for a beautiful illustrated edition in America, and she'd done the editor had done a selection, and she'd left out the story I feel you have to have, which is very like Ragnarok when you think about it. It's about a little boy who died, and he was buried, and his mother came to his grave, and he stuck his arm out of the grave, and she couldn't get it to go in. And then next time he went, he stuck his arm out, and finally she hit it until it went in and stayed there. And this is a terrible story. And again, it's incommensurate with a child's imagination. You don't want to know that, but the moment you read it, you know that at some level it's true, in some way. And nobody's being nice to you when they tell this story. And there's a scene here where quite early in the novel, when the characters enact the story of Cinderella, or at least the puppet master, the Puppenmeister, enacts the story of Cinderella at this English party for which they're all preparing the lovely garden lights and everything. But he enacts the German version, in which dreadful things happen to the horrible sisters. A sort of dreadful vengeance happens, whereas the English one slides away. And my English audience mostly doesn't know what to think. You know, they're used to the other version, where things are made happy ever after, despite obviously not being. So actually, I've said quite a lot about what I feel about German literature and things.
The other play that this puppet group performs is the Sandman.
Oh dear, yes. I didn't read the Sandman until I read this book, and I was deeply shocked by it. I still am, in fact, partly because it hasn't got any form. It keeps moving around and things happen, and you think, I know where this is going now. And you think, you know, the hero has found out that the woman is a puppet. So he'll be all right now. But he just isn't. And finally, he kills himself, which again I think of as German, because nothing exactly leads up to it. It just is the state of affairs. I mean, I'm describing to you a whole series of terrible things which are making me smile, and this is sort of my relation to it all. It's,
But there are so many elements of that story that resonate with the larger story of your book. And that's what makes it so very interesting, the question of shadows, and as you say, the suicide. But there's also this real concern with the puppet and how it's made, and you know, this concern of how can a puppet act a puppet rather than...
I enjoyed that, no end. Because again, I think that's what I most like about writing, is the pleasure of having the idea of a puppet playing a puppet, and then working out exactly how physically to do it, how to turn it into a real thing. And I feel safe. I feel that language can be trusted if it has enough things in it. But I increasingly can't use abstract words. Who is it I'm reading by Hofmannsthal?
Well, I mean, presumably the letter, the Lord Chandos
Yes.
letter.
The
which
Lord
is-
Chandos letter I only read
Yeah.
a few months ago, and it has knocked me over.
Yeah.
Because I know exactly what he's saying.
Mm.
He's saying that most of the words we use actually don't really mean anything.
Mm.
And he's reduced to not being able to write at all. And I sometimes, well, whenever I think I'm getting there, I invent another very complicated object. You would also notice that that jar is actually not possible, I think. Nobody could really pop that jar. It's just too difficult. And I have a friend who's a painter who was reading about my paintings. I write people's paintings in other places. And he said, none of your paintings could be painted. They're in their head and their language.
But I mean, the being in language, that paradox is there in the Hofmannsthal Chandos letter, because it's a wonderfully articulate letter about language not working.
Yes,
and it needs that, and it needs the metaphors and the similes and so on for the abyss that opens up and so on. Can I just ask you, as we're on to sort of darkness, we'll get off darkness in a moment, but the children's book ends with the First World War, and you acknowledge there the absolute brutality. It's not simply a sketch. I mean, it is there. It is fashioned.
yes.
And obviously the Magic Mountain, which you referred to, 1,000 pages of loving attention to ideas and complexity, and yet in the mud of Flanders or wherever it is, perhaps none of it matters, or perhaps it does. Did you always know, I'm sorry, it's a naive question, when you were writing the novel, it was going to end there? Did you know the children's book had to end there as part of your historical periodisation, or did it come to you?
I can more or less remember it coming to me, though I think that may be another mental construct. You won't believe this, but I started writing this book about a children's writer in the 1880s, 1890s, and I started inventing all the children. And I started inventing the kind of do-gooding Fabian, which was also very useful, society that people belonged to. And my sense of history is not that good. So it wasn't until rather late I started writing a chronology, which I've got to that with the present novel and it's driving me crazy. But I suddenly asked myself for the first time, what would all my children be doing in 1920? And I saw that they would have all had to go off to the war, that an ordinary kind of novel future couldn't be given to them. Equally, I saw that I was very lucky because I had constructed the beginning of the novel not knowing about the war, and my characters didn't know about the war. And I thought if I never cast the story forward, if I never used the phrase he was to think or she was to see, I always stay exactly in the present in the story, then the war can be the kind of shock it was. And the book I'm writing now will end with the Second World War, which was a completely different kind of shock and has to have different metaphors and things attached to it. But I was quite pleased about the war. And then I thought to myself, I talked to my publisher, I said, I don't know whether to put the war in or to stop before it. She did what she always does, which is throw the question back at me very intelligently. And then I suddenly saw that you actually, if you led all your readers right up to the fringe of the First World War and didn't tell them what happened to anyone, they would all throw the book into the bath. So then I had to write the First World War. And one reviewer, noticed that I had invented far too many male children in order to be able to kill some without killing my major characters or most of my major characters. I mean, statistically, I had to have a lot more people ready to be killed than I wanted to kill. And this one man noticed that, rather grudgingly pointed out, which he was quite right about. But that was all quite difficult. The other thing that was quite difficult about the war was that there's something to do with Olive, which I've again lost.
I think it is also a shock to the reader, even though, of course, as readers we know about the war, but it does come because also the writing changes, I feel, and it's this, all this poetry and all this storytelling has to come to an end, and all that seems possible to do with words is just to
Describe.
yeah, to describe, but very, very viscerally, what's going on. But then also having this string of making poetry with names.
Oh yes, I found as a friend of Peter's and mine, I wrote a lot of poems in possession, and I was writing this, and I was giving a lecture in Copenhagen. And I bumped into a Pole, as you do in Copenhagen, in the kind of world writers move in. And he said that he had written his thesis on the poetry in possession. And then he said, "What are you doing now?" So I said, "I'm writing a book called The Children's Book, which will go up to the First World War." "Oh," he said, "you will write First World War poetry." Totally and horribly challenged. But I just read the names, because there are poems in this book. They're sort of there's a I haven't marked it. There is a list of names of trenches. Maybe I can't find it. Anyway, I made a long poem out of the trenches, which were named, and I got it all into scanning English. And then it got bought by the New Yorker as a story before the novel was published. And the New Yorker does fact-checking on everything. And somebody rang me up in total panic from New York and said, all these trench names, we can't find them all, we're trying very hard, we haven't got time, you've got to tell us where they all came from. So I told them about the book written by Peterson, my friend, about the trench names and the trenches in general. And then I said, you know, the one or two I invented. And they said, you can't do that. You must give the source. They were editors. And I lost my temper then.
Perhaps we touched a little bit on it. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the novel you're writing at the moment?
Ah, yes. I was thinking as we were talking, because having lived a long life of always doing 3 or 4 things at once, I have learned how to keep a novel running underneath whatever else I'm doing. Keeping the current novel running under the predecessor is peculiarly difficult. But the novel I am writing goes from England to Austria, to Germany, to Paris and back to England. And it moves between the 2 world wars. And this is another, so I keep telling jokes. I said to the same editor, I told her I was thinking of writing a novel about psychoanalysts. And then I told her something about, I had also realised there was a novel to be written about surrealists. And she, rather to my horror, said, that would be much more interesting. And she hadn't said that, and I'd done quite a lot of work on the psychoanalysts. So she says she didn't say that, but people always do. So then I went home and thought, well, shall I do the one or the other first? And then I thought, I am really very old. You know, it can't be the one or the other. It has to be both at once. And then, this is one of the sort of glorious moments of being an artist, I realised they were the same thing in many ways. They all made objects out of dreams. They all invented unreal languages. They deliberately wouldn't use normal speech. And I'm having a lovely time with it. But the poems that are coming in aren't at all like the poems that came into the children's book, because they're irrational. And there's this wonderful moment when André Breton says artists should make the things they see in their dreams, which is sort of one of the central things in this book. And at the moment, as I say, I'm only in Vienna, and I know what will come up in Berlin, and I know what will come up in Paris, but then I'm a bit stuck.
But it seems to move very directly from what you were writing about in the children's book.
I realised that again when I was thinking about coming here. I think it does carry it straight on, except the characters are quite different, because none of the children's book characters, or almost none, would be either psychoanalysts or surrealists. But it does take my image of, as it were, the imaginative world, the imagined world, on from one to the other.